Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome. On behalf of Bardia Perry, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel session, Data Breaches, What Happens Next? For those I haven't met, my name is Jason Sprague. I'm a partner in the corporate commercial section of the firm, and I'll be moderating today's session. A bit of housekeeping before we get underway. Amenities are outside to the left before you exit. Also, please turn your phones to silent so we don't have any of those embarrassing calls that come through. And we'll have some questions at the end. We'll have some time for questions. And for those of you who are online, please put your questions through the chat and we'll have those responded to at the end of the session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and recognise a continuing connection to our land, waters and culture. I extend my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So now that we've done the formalities, I'll introduce this afternoon's panel. To my far right, we have Joseph Kavidia, who is an expert in cybersecurity. Joseph is the founder of Blacklight Security. He launched Blacklight Security in 2024 to support businesses facing heightening risks from cybersecurity threats and to provide simple and effective solutions to counter those threats. Blacklight is a team of offensive security experts. I'm told that's not their personality. From the Five Eyes military backgrounds. In his early career, Joseph worked in applied research, developing neural networks and served in the New Zealand Army. In the centre, we have Raul Caceres, who will provide practical insights into an organisation impacted by a data breach. Now, Raul is the Executive Director of Operations at Canteen Australia. Raul has a Bachelor of Engineering and a Masters of Science and has worked with a range of corporate and not-for-profit organisations around the world. Over the past 4 years, Raul has been the architect and leader of the transformation change that Canteen's data and technology team has facilitated for the organisation. Bardia Perry has worked with Canteen for many years, and we're very grateful to have Raul here today. To my immediate right is my fellow partner in our corporate commercial team, Michael Cassetto. He advises on a range of commercial transactions with a special interest in licensing distribution, as well as deep understanding of intellectual property and IT law. This includes writing advice on managing intangible assets, commercialising technology, privacy, data, and IT issues. So thank you to all our panellists. Now, to set today's framework for the panel, data breaches are often described as cyber incidents, but in reality, they are much broader than that. They are legal events, operational events, communications events, governance events, and for those people whose information is involved, very personal events. So the question for organisations today is not simply, can we prevent every breach? The better question is, when something goes wrong, will we know what to do? Who decides, who communicates, and how we protect the people affected? Today, we're going to bring these perspectives together with our legal, cybersecurity, and industry experts on the panel. The aim is not to create a checklist for every possible scenario, because every breach is different. The aim is to understand the decisions that matter, the mistakes organisations commonly make, and the practical steps that can make a breach response faster, calmer, and more effective. For those in the room, has anyone been the subject of a cyber incident in the last sort of 6 months or 12 months? Show of hands, there's a few there. Yep. Would you say that you could identify the information quickly in 24 hours? Most people are shaking their heads at that one. And would you be confident that your board executive team would know who's in charge in the first 6 hours? A couple of yeses, a couple of blank looks. So for those who have blank looks, you're in the right spot. We'll help you out. All right. So let's start at that sort of level. Many organisations still talk about cyber risk as something they're trying to prevent. Prevention is essential, but resilience assumes that something may still get through. So question for our panellists. Is it realistic that organisations today expect that they won't suffer a cyber breach or a data breach? Or should they be planning on the basis that one will actually happen? I'll start with Joseph.
Sure, yeah, off the bat, I would say no, not realistic that you won't experience a cyber breach. I think it's 90% of businesses over the course of their lifetime will experience a cyber breach, so it's basically going to happen. The magnitude of it varies, so if it's going to be, one user and some of their personal information inside of the organization, that could be different to a ransomware across the entire organization that means you can't do any client work and all of your customers are being compromised. So it varies in terms of magnitude. I'd say the best thing you can do is expect it to happen and then plan that it'll happen kind of at every level. So assume they'll breach an account. Okay, how can we make it clear so that if they do breach an account, they can't get too much information? Assume they get some information. How can we make it so the information isn't holding too much significant data related to customers, let's say, or personally identifiable information, so on and so forth. We call it defense in depth, kind of having these layers in place, assuming that you'll have a compromise.
So, Arul, before the incident affecting your organization, what did you think a breach response would be like, and what surprised you?
I think we were lucky in our situation in particular because we had just done a simulation a couple of months before the real data breach happened. What we had not expected was the fact that we were putting a lot of attention in our own systems, and when this data breach happened, it happened with a third party that had access to some of our information. So we were not as prepared on that third party prevention. And so after the data breach happened, we put a lot more attention into also ensuring that all our third party partners had the same level of protection as we did internally.
Another one for Joseph. From what you've seen in the risk or in the threat environment, what's changed in the last few years?
I mean, everybody's talking about AI now. It's a little bit of an exhausted buzzword, but to be honest, out there, it hasn't really changed the landscape too much immediately. I think we're going to see a lot more changes from it. The ability for attackers to, move fast and let's say, we don't have to spend 4 or 5 years learning a lot of new techniques to be able to break into companies or hack them, as it were. You can just ask, an agent that you've got or an AI to do a lot of it for you. So I think it'll accelerate a lot people's ability to break into companies. Fortunately, on the counterpart, on the defensive side, we have the same benefit. We can have AIs working for us to make our defenses better. But in terms of landscape overall, there's definitely been an uptick in what we call nation state offensive operations. So that's like countries funded by governments, attacking other countries or corporations inside of countries. We'll see a lot from the sort of Russia-Ukraine conflict. There's been quite an uptick as a result of that. Also from Iran as a result of sort of recent geopolitical instability. So I think we might continue to see an increase in that. The unfortunate side effect is that a lot of businesses, even like ourselves here in Australia, can be impacted by that because there's some way, it could be one particular customer of one particular company here is very significant and has some data, and a nation state has decided that data is significant, and so they'll be targeted as a result, and it can often be like a supply chain link. But yeah, in terms of how it's changed, I think that we'll start to see more of the effects of AI and cybersecurity over the coming years. There's definitely like a bit of a delay in terms of uptake, and it hasn't been as overt as I think we were expecting. But yeah, stay alert.
I think a metric we capture in the organization is how many emails we have to quarantine. So from the total number of emails we get on a particular period of time, how many are emails that are attempting to do a phishing attack. A couple of years ago, there used to be 2 or 3 emails for every 100 emails. At the moment, we're tracking around 14, 15 emails in every 100 emails. So about 15% of every email that we get is basically trying to do a phishing attack. And it's going to continue getting worse, as Joseph said. With AI, they're just getting very, very sophisticated. And sometimes they're not putting links, they're not putting files. They're sort of trying to get the people out of the systems to then trying to do some type of social engineering on the side, which is, it gets pretty scary at the moment.
Yeah, I think we've seen an uptick also with that, the phishing and the social engineering component as well, to try and just get a phone call initiated or something outside of a link. And for the AI, they're getting very sophisticated in terms of what you get presented with. I mean, I very rarely trust anything I get these days on an SMS. But also interesting you mentioned AI. I think everyone's probably heard about the AIs breaking the sandboxes. And they've been designed to hack systems, and they've actually broken the restraints and gone in and hacked other systems, and that's just what they do. And so the AI threat is increasing as they get more powerful, more sophisticated as well. Quick one for you, Michael. In terms of the legal risk, when does that actually start? Is that when the breach actually happens, or is it early when there's some sort of suspicion or uncertainty about a potential attack?
Well, I think in terms of concerns for a board and legal risk, I think that starts, from now or from before. I mean, it's always been there. There's been that risk. But I think people have kind of shifted their thinking about cyber risk from being just an IT related risk. It's actually a business wide risk. And I think, we were talking a little bit before about, some of the things that have changed. One of the things that has changed is like people's awareness about cyber, the preparedness of organisations, I think, has increased a lot. And I don't think a lot of boards are now thinking, oh, will we be breached? They're more asking the question about, are we prepared for a breach? And I think that's probably a big shift. And so the legal risk or the risk, really starts from the get-go.
That's an excellent segue into the next part of what we're going to look at in the sort of preparedness and the governance and accountability side of things. So just following on from that question and response, Michael, what should an organisation have in place before a breach so that they can manage their legal obligations quickly?
Well, I think there's probably a few questions that organisations should be sort of asking themselves, or an organisation, or let me put it another way, an organisation that is well prepared will know who is in charge when a breach occurs, what the escalation process is for a breach, and how key decisions will be made during dealing with a breach. One of the key things that an organisation can have in its armoury, I guess, is a incident response plan. So organisations should have a plan about how they're going to deal with a data breach. But, and I'm sure the other panellists will agree that it's not just about having a plan, it's about being prepared and testing the plan. And so, yeah, you should definitely have a data response plan, but you need to test it. And the best way of doing that is a bit like what Raul was saying before about, how his organisation had tested their plan, a couple of months before they had suffered a data breach. So yeah. Incident response plan.
Yeah. Oh, I guess the key thing is that you have as many plans as you like, but you've got to be able to implement the plan with something people can follow and be something which is useful to the organisation. So Raul, with the plans that Canteen had in place, what was the bit that mattered most in the actual, when it got to the coal face and things were the tires, rubber's hitting the road? Was it the written plan, escalation procedures, external advisors? What was key?
So the first part is to decide who needs to be part of the response team in this situation, because it appeared that it was going to be a big one. So we had people from within the services team, fundraising team. We contacted some micro supporters on the legal side. We had a cyber expert, a PR, contact our insurance, and at the beginning of the breach, basically start meeting a couple of times per day to start investigating as much as we can, especially trying to identify how many people were impacted and the kind of details that were impacted, so that we could decide firstly whether we needed to inform the information commissioner, because we decided that if we decide that it's a likelihood of risk of serious harm, then it's a reportable breach, and then working with the different experts that we brought onto the table to understand the extent of the incident and start planning the different stages on the response. But as Michael said, having the board involved from the very beginning was also critical. So our data breach response plan has us informing the board within 24 hours of us identifying, or even earlier if we confirm that it's an actual data breach. But because it was a third party, the part that was a little bit difficult was to start getting information from that third party, because it was a lot of charities that were involved at the same time. So just working together, the group of charities, to put some pressure on the third party to be more transparent and sharing with the group more detail into what happened, how it happened, and how many people were impacted in terms of their data being breached.
I suppose one of the key things as well with any response plan is it's going to have escalation tiers within it. So you're not going to reporting to the board on something which is fairly minor. You're going to have escalations about who should be in the room, who should be contacted, and steps to be taken. So Joseph, in terms of having a plan in place, how often do you think they should be tested?
At least once a year. I think we work quite a lot on the response side of things. So, with Raul and their organization, Canteen, when they had a breach, did you guys call in experts to sort of come in and help you with the response? Yeah. So typically we'll be the experts that companies will bring in to respond. Often what we'll find is we'll get in there. First scenario is the organization doesn't have an incident response plan, which is fine. We kind of know what to do, but there will be bits of missing information we kind of have to uncover. The second scenario is they have an incident response plan, but nobody's ever looked at it. It's, 80 pages thick and it's filled with information about, how we should do our jobs rather than useful information about the company that would be relevant in the event of an incident. And then the third scenario is when the organization has an incident response plan. Maybe it's 10 or 20 pages, but they've actually tested it, maybe at least once a year or so. And so when it comes sort of down to the wire, somebody like Raul inside the organization can say, hey, here's all the key information in the incident response plan that you'll need to be able to handle this incident properly. And that's useful. The first two completely useless. So having an incident response plan and testing it in our experience is what actually makes it useful, because then you can see whether or not the incident response plan will hold up under fire. You also find out when you do the exercise. So you'll have kind of a simulation, as it were, once a year, and you'll say, hey, let's assume that this has happened, and then go through the sort of exercise with everybody in the room who might be involved with the incident of how you would approach that. And if you have an incident response plan you can work through, you'll find the gaps in it. You can fill in that information so that when an incident comes about, it's actually useful.
I think, Raul, we spoke about the data breach with Canteen. You were saying you tested your plan only 2 months prior to that incident occurring. So from your perspective, that was one of the key things that made the response a lot easier, the organisation.
Indeed, because we had all of the systems in place, like from the technical perspective, how we get people into the response team, who we need to contact, and we did have the same people that helped us during the real breach. They were part of the simulation as well, which made things a lot easier, because it was quite a sophisticated attack that the third party suffered. So they had to deal with a malicious actor overseas, and they have to get into the dark web and trying to identify how much information they really had. So having an expert on our side was also very critical during that process.
So you're able to assemble the people quickly, gave them roles to execute. That made the whole thing a lot smoother, and ultimately for the organisation protected it from other risks that may have arisen.
Yes, but as you said as well, having a one person who can lead the whole effort. So in our case, that's me because of my role, and then being able to activate and deactivate different people within the response team, depending on the type of incident that we have.
Yeah, because some of the things that we have seen is that organisations often like to rule by committee sometimes, and when you have a very intense, urgent period, sometimes that's not going to work. And you do need to have somebody who can execute the plan, have direction, have guidance for the organisation to be able to respond effectively and minimise its risks.
Just on that point, I should just sort of clarify that, because ruling by committee is not the role of the board. So the board's role is really just to make sure that the organisation is prepared. But when it comes to the response, the board should not necessarily be involved in the response. The response is the responsibility of the executive management team and the people identified in the response plan. So the board's role is really just to, question, make sure that the organisation is ready, but it's not there to actually be involved, sleeves up, in the response.
Great. All right, so let's now move to the moment the incident's actually been discovered. So the first 24, 72 hours. Let's say it's 6:30 a.m, because all these things happen at the wee hours of the morning. Someone's discovered some suspicious activity, provider is called, or data appears to be exposed. Really what happens next is, typically a little bit messy. Alarm bells are ringing, everyone's running around frantically. The organisation needs speed, but also needs facts. So for Joseph, what are the first things that you want to know when you are called into a suspected breach?
What has been affected insofar as they know, like, how did they identify it? Was it some user device that had 2,000 emails send off from it within a 3-second time span? Was it, a particular group of servers perhaps shutting down and going offline and then restarting with, 90% CPU usage or something? What kind of made them think they had a breach in the first place? And then once we have that information, we kind of work out from there. It's, it's like you would see on crime scene investigation TV show, something like that. You know, you get a little piece of information and then you start looking for clues elsewhere and you kind of work your way out. It's quite fun. Minus the stress of, you know, the people who are being impacted. You know, we try to keep that to ourselves, the excitement, but the but the enjoyment and the interest of, you know, following these clues and being able to come to a conclusion is quite interesting and enjoyable. And obviously for us, the outcome is obviously very beneficial for the company. So, but yeah, just finding out what initially sort of raised their suspicions, and then we work our way out from there, and having access to whoever we need in the organization to be able to get as much information as we need as well.
Have you ever been involved with attackers still being inside the system?
Yes, very commonly. Yeah. So typically, attackers will be dormant inside of an organization, or, you know, not raising alarm bells for about 260 days before they're discovered. So that's normal. That was an IBM report from 2025 that came out reporting that. So it's wild. You know, it's as I said, 90% of businesses experience a breach. You know, half of the people in this room are in a business who are currently, you know, breached in some way. It might just be one device. It could be the whole network. Who knows? But that's kind of what to expect. And typically when we get in there, something we have to bear in mind quite strongly is we don't want to alert the attacker that we are onto them, because in the same way, you know, you trap a, you know, cat in a corner and it's going to pounce at you. In the same way, if an attacker realizes that we're onto them and, you know, we might be tracking them or coming after them or sort of shutting down their access, they might, you know, react and you know, pull off what they've been planning for half a year or so in that time span.
Nikki.
Yeah.
Michael, what are the legal issues which are critical to start assessing? For example, how would you manage things such as, you know, legal privilege and regulatory assessment while the technical facts are still developing?
Well, I think one of the mistakes a lot of people make is trying to rush and come to conclusions, right? So sure, the first 24 hours is really messy because people are trying to contain the breach. People still don't know exactly, you know, what's happened. People don't know exactly what information has been accessed or breached. So there's a lot of questions to be asked. And I know that, so usually I'd kind of find the first, you know, 24 hours or 72 hours is all about just trying to contain the breach, trying to understand and learn as much as you can about the information that's been compromised. In terms of, what was it you were asking about, like legal privilege?
Amount of information which is being exposed. You're thinking, well, does legal privilege still apply? Is it being lost in the breach? How's it managed?
Well, I think a lot of that will depend on the type of information that has been taken. But I think often the questions that get asked are around notification, because a lot of people are aware of the data notification scheme or the breach scheme, and the need to notify. But in Australia, we're kind of lucky in the sense that we have 30 days to make a decision. And while the Information Commissioner or the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner says that you should be trying to work that out and make an assessment as quickly as possible, I would say don't rush into that decision. You need to get the information. You need to understand what information has been taken. And that usually takes, you know, days, and sometimes it can take even longer. I'm not sure, Joseph, but you probably would say that it can take, sometimes weeks to sort of really understand what information is being taken. So, you know, a lot of questions get asked, but I usually would advise people just your stakeholders will want information. So you do need to provide some information, but you just tell them what you know. And what you know might be that there's been a breach, but you don't yet know what data has been accessed. And you might know, a little bit. You can share, obviously, whatever information you can, but as long as you keep people informed, I think that's the main thing. You don't have to have all the answers straight away. Yeah.
And I think that's a really good point, because we decided to be very transparent from the beginning. So we created a page in our website where we were putting the most up-to-date information in relation to the breach. We're very lucky. We have over 100,000 reporters every year. And from those people, after we communicated what happened, we only had about 50 or so people that decided to finish their contributions. everyone else just was very grateful that we were able to be transparent and we could be explaining it was a third party that was impacted. They also understood that and continued their support.
Just following on from that, what was the hardest decision for Canteen in those first 24 hours? Was it the containment, messaging, internal processes, third-party management? What was the hardest sort of decision there?
I think just as Michael mentioned, just trying to think through, let's agree on what we actually do know, because there's a lot of bits and pieces of information that start surfacing in those first 24 hours. So just making sure that we really communicated only the things that we were 100% sure about. And then that stage was just, we know that there's been a breach. We were informed by a third party. We are now currently investigating everything that we can so we can provide you with the most up-to-date information and nothing else. So it did take like a couple of weeks before the third party actually released the information and told us exactly who was impacted and what kind of information. And then obviously at that point, we were able to segregate all of our data and have a specific communication to every individual, depending on the type of fields that were impacted and the level of risk that we felt they were under, depending on the number of fields that were impacted for them.
I think in the Canteen incident as well, I think there was a little bit of, maybe just a little bit of tension around, do we need to notify or not? Because some of the information that was accessed included, say, like, bank details or that kind of thing, right? Because we're talking about donor information. The view at the time was that it probably wasn't sufficient sort of information to sort of warrant a serious, or having a serious impact on the individuals. But at the same time, Canteen wanted to be transparent and open with its donors, right? So just because you don't have that obligation to notify, I've kind of found that often a lot of organisations prefer to notify just to get the information out there. Because one thing about a data breach is that it's not the breach itself that destroys people's trust. It's probably the way that you respond to the breach that will determine whether trust with your customers or your stakeholders is lost.
And I must say that we did also get in touch with someone directly at the Office of the Information Commissioner, and they were quite helpful in terms of helping us navigate, because the company that had the data breach, they went out of business, and especially because of the response was really poor, and all of their clients basically dropped within a few months of the incident happening. So we have to contact the Office of the Information Commissioner to confirm that the case was closed, and we found that they hadn't closed the case because the company had gone out of business, but they were very helpful to go through those final steps. So I will recommend, I know we're saying we don't need to, we should wait, but we did find it quite useful to just get in touch and ask a few questions to make sure that you have a reasonable amount of information to decide if the data that's been breached is enough to create a risk of serious harm, which is the main thing.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the first 24, 72 hours, there was always this urgency to do stuff. But the key thing is really stop the bleeding, find the intrusion, lock it down, make sure there's no further damage being done. Then you've got time post that to assess, really look at the information that's available and start to prepare and plan your responses, whether that be notifying the regulators, notifying your customers. But I think it's just important to understand you do have time, you can draw breath and start to plan a response. But again, you've got to make sure that the attack has been stopped and there's nothing further being taken in terms of any breach issues. This is for all of you. What is the bigger risk in the first 24 hours? Doing too little or saying too much?
I think saying too much. What was it? Doing too little?
Doing too little or saying too much?
Yeah, I think saying too much. As I said before, we have we're lucky in Australia, we have 30 days to make an assessment. In other jurisdictions, it's a lot less, but I don't think there's a risk of doing too little, because usually it's quite frantic in the first 24 to 72 hours, particularly in the with the IT team. and having forensic specialists come in. I mean, there's a lot of people working to try and contain the breach, right? So, but I think you don't want to go out too early and say something that's incorrect. You need to have a well-considered communication and plan.
I think a lot of the time with a data breach, it's so stressful for a lot of people. A lot of people have never experienced it before. There's so many potential ramifications of it. And also it's quite frightening, the idea of, a hacker being, inside their computer or something. It's a real black box for a lot of people. So I think I agree with Michael. It's really saying too much is the worst thing you can do. Because, the reality is, if you come to somebody and say, who's in the organization or a potential customer or somebody like that, and you say, hey, we've had a data breach, well, they're going to have a million questions and you're not going to have a single answer to any of them. You're better coming to them a week later when you can set them at ease and say, here's all of the answers to your questions. Here's what data has been impacted. Here's what we've done about it, and so on and so forth. So I definitely think saying too much is a worse approach. Yeah.
Okay, right.
I was going to say, one of the practical things, we do have like a central repository for the latest key messages, and we have a spokesperson who is not the same person that does leads the response. So then I will then assign that person to be the one that, if anyone comes to us, media supporters, service users, they can always go to the one person that has the most up-to-date key messages to share.
Right. So we have to talk about finding the facts, stopping the bleeding, but as we know, the organisation has to do something. And I said the organisation has some time to think about it and do it. But in terms of that process, and this is, again, one of the things where people often get very confused about, I suppose, the incident, the data breach. And so this is for Michael. What's the difference between a cyber incident, a privacy breach, and an eligible data breach that must be notified?
Okay, so I'll try and answer the cyber incident. I mean, you should probably be asking Joseph what a cyber incident is. But,
Joseph can chime in.
But a cyber incident, I think, is really just an event that compromises or threatens the security of or integrity of a information system, right? So your IT system. So at a high level, a cyber incident does not necessarily need to involve personal information. It could just be that your IT system has been compromised in some way. A privacy breach, by the terminology, involves a breach of privacy, which means then that some personal information has been accessed without authority or disclosed without authority. And then I think the last one you mentioned was eligible data breach, and that is a privacy breach which has the risk of causing significant harm to the individual whose information has been taken. So you can kind of think of it in a hierarchy. So, cyber incident is at the top. Privacy breach is a cyber incident that involves access to personal information. And then a notifiable data breach is an incident that involves personal information, which is going to cause serious harm to the individual.
Which leads me to my next question. What is likely to result in serious harm actually mean in practice, and what do you need to assess it?
Okay, so likely to cause serious harm would be something. It would basically be a situation where there's a real and not a remote chance of some serious harm being caused to an individual. That serious harm could be financial harm, it could be psychological harm, it could be emotional harm or reputational harm. So when we're assessing whether or not there has been an eligible data breach, I mean, of course, that's the thing that we're looking at. But in terms of trying to assess whether or not that has occurred, we will look at the type of information that has been accessed. So if you think about, someone who's hacked into a computer system and obtained my name and my email address, that's kind of public information. It doesn't really matter. So that's not likely to cause me serious harm. But if someone has access to not even necessarily just bank account details, but they have access to a passcode for my bank account, well, then that is likely to cause me serious harm. And it just depends on the context of the information as well, because it's not only financial information, it could be health information, so information about my health. But if you think about it again, you know, it depends on the circumstances, but to give an analogy or an example, if people hacked into a system and found out that I had suffered from a broken leg or something, again, that's unlikely to cause me any serious harm. But if they hacked into a system and found out that I had a serious, you know, mental health condition, then that might cause serious harm, right, to me. So it really depends on the information, but hopefully that gives you a bit of colour and a bit of understanding about what it might mean.
Now, Rael, in terms of when the organisation was assessing whether or not to notify if it was a notifiable data breach, what was your assessment in terms of the serious harm aspects?
So we did work with Michael on this one. And I think for us, we were also lucky that we had started changing all of our systems so that we did not hold any credit card information. And so we had like a technical way so that all you hold is a special token, so that if that token gets stolen, there's really no way for the person that stole it to use it. So the financial information that this third party was holding was over 15 years old, and at that point it was assessed that it was no longer a risk to the individuals. We did still communicate it to them and explain that, for example, if we found that a bank account was listed on the data that was stolen, we told them that a bank account was also part of the breach. But as a whole, there was like a system that was developed to put people under different levels of risks, and no group or canteen was identified as having a risk of serious harm. But again, we did also decided to be proactive and communicate with the officer through the third party and all the charities combined that were impacted. We also communicated as a group using the same messages to all of our supporters. So that was also very helpful because the communication was so coordinated across the whole group of charities.
So I think one of the most difficult things for organisations is working out, is something notifiable? What is risk of serious harm? And quite often, look, the public sector agencies, the reaction is let's just notify, let's just disclose. Now, there's a moral element to disclosing, which we've discussed in terms of trust and those sort of things, but also in terms of what is an actual notifiable data breach. It's a very fluid issue, and there's a lot of organisations do get very concerned or confused. As Rael said, engaging with the OAIC is one of the key things to do. They're always more towards the favour of disclosure, of course. That's what they do. But it's so reliant on so many different factors, and there's no real clear playbook to say this is in, this is out necessarily. It's going to be assessment, and it can get very granular, which is one of the challenging things with data breaches, particularly when you've got an extensive data breach with thousands of individuals impacted. But ultimately, as Michael was saying, it could be situations where you've got two individuals, there could be one piece of information that's different between them, and one of them could be at a high risk of serious harm just because of that one piece of information. So that is challenging. Hopefully some of the AI stuff can help accelerate some of the assessments of those bits and pieces, but no, that's a difficult thing in terms of working out what is serious harm. For Joseph, in terms of when you do your analysis, you found that finding out where the information may have been released, say onto the dark web, or knowing who the actors are, because I suppose in your industry you probably have a bit of an idea about who some of these bad actors might be. Have you found that that's been important information feeding into that assessment of serious harm for individuals?
Definitely. There's definitely different sort of tiers of attackers or bad actors, as you say. And like I mentioned before, some of them are nation state and they've got, government funding and they're very, very sophisticated. And if they target you, there's really not much you can do about it, except, how would you call it? Damage control. I would say there's different considerations we have when we're talking with, whether it's the board or whether it's the IT team in terms of how critical or, significant or severe a data breach could be. If we find any evidence, we have what are called indicators of compromise. There's specific indicators of compromise in systems that are related to, particular ransomware gangs or, particularly malicious actors. If they're flagged or they come up as part of the investigation, we'll let the board know, hey, this is probably a lot more serious than it might have otherwise been just because of who's targeted you and who's managed to get in. For example, ransomware gangs are notorious. There's a lot of them out there. If we find, some indication that they're inside of an organization's system, we have high reason for concern that there might be a ransomware attack that'll take place even after some minor incident has been flagged that's alerted us to that they're in their systems. And so we'll have to do some investigation and from that point, but it will also, raise the, I suppose, stakes of the investigation. Like I said, that cat in the corner, if they realize we're onto them and they deploy a ransomware attack and, prevent you from accessing any of your customer data, personal information. I mean, if you came into work tomorrow and you couldn't access your email and you couldn't access, writing any documents, you couldn't communicate with customers and all of that was just gone. And there was just this, message on your screen saying, pay us, 400 Bitcoin or you're not going to get any of your systems back. And they can do that. They might have found your backups and they can literally wipe everything. We've seen that happen. There was a company last year. They were called, strange name, Knights of the Old Realm or something. They were 160 years old. They got ransomware, and I think they did about $200 million a year in revenue. Over the course of 3 months, the company didn't exist anymore because they got ransomware. Their backups were caught, and everything was gone. So they didn't know who their customers were anymore. They didn't have any information on their customers. They didn't have any, email history. Everything completely gone. So the company had to shut down. So yeah, if we have some suspicion that a particularly nasty bad actor is in there, it'll definitely raise the stakes. Yeah.
Wow, that's scary stuff. I was going to make some quip about their systems being as old as them, but it's sobering stuff when you hear that information can just be completely removed. They get into the backups and everything is just gone, and the organization crumbles, essentially.
Yeah, it's really, we definitely have there's two kinds of perspectives that businesses will have on it. One will be, oh, we're so small, who would ever care about us? Which is, fair enough in some cases. But the reality is, like I said, 90% of businesses will experience it. It's not about it being, how would you call it? It's not about it being, oh, it would be, insignificant. We'll just get an insurance payout if it happens. It's the reality that if it happens, it can be so catastrophic that you can't recover. And so it's worth doing, really just the bare minimum to get yourself to a place where you have a bit of peace of mind. Because also how a lot of these actors will operate is they'll just find the lowest hanging fruit and go after them. Because, as hackers, we're kind of lazy. We want to find the easiest way in. We don't really... we like sort of complexity and stuff, but we like to find the easiest way in because, especially in the hacking communities, there's a big deal about clout. If they can do something really simple, there's examples of U.S. government servers that have just been openly available online without decent password protection, and a hacker will log in, post all of this information from the NSA online. And they'll kind of brag about it online. Hey, it was so easy to break into these guys and show off about it. And they really will go after the lowest hanging fruit because it's easy and they have automated scanners and whatever else doing this for them. So if you really do the bare minimum, you pull yourself out of a category that makes you a really significant and easy target.
I think that's one of the key things also is doing at least the bare minimum. And a lot of organizations will say, well, how much do we need to do? It's expensive. There's a whole lot of reasons why not. But ultimately, it's your business. Do you want to protect it or not? I mean, you've got to do these things. It's just part of business today in the digital world. If you don't have that protection in place at a bare minimum, as Joseph was saying, you are open to attack because they are scanning for these, say, low-hanging fruit. Just a quick one for you, Rael. In terms of stakeholder communications, what was it that the stakeholders in Canteen wanted straight away? Was it, or what was their primary things? Was it speed? Was it detail, reassurance, practical steps? What were the things that they were looking for in terms of those communications?
Yeah, I think for us it was really about providing the information, like real information in real time, as much as we could. So we kept updating this page that we had with all the most up-to-date information daily, sometimes multiple times during the day, depending on what was happening in our communication with our other charities and the third party. And then we set up a line as well that anyone could call at any time to get more information. And then the third party provided an external line. It's an external company that you can also engage that is specialized in data breach management, so people can call and can understand what they can do to minimize the impact of the data breach.
This is one just for the panel generally. Are you finding there's a bit more of an acceptance for people to fess up, so to speak? I mean, early days, there's quite a lot of concern about litigation, class actions, which still do happen. and almost a stigma about saying we've been hacked or that we had a data breach. You find there's less resistance to notifications these days, or less resistance to being open about those issues?
Yes. So is the short answer. But yeah, look, I have found that over the years, certainly when Canteen experienced the breach, which I think was in 2023, right? So back then, I think there was probably less acceptance of the fact that it was going to happen to any organisation, right? And it's only been 3 years that's passed since then. I think people were starting to have that thinking, but I don't think it was deep sort of seated. So yeah, I've found that people are more willing to be open, and I think they have found that by being open and providing communication to stakeholders and letting people know about it is often the better way to go, rather than trying to pretend there wasn't a breach, or trying to sit in that category of it's not a notifiable data breach, so let's not worry about it. So I just find, I think one of the good things about the Canteen's response was the fact that they, you had your plan, you'd done the simulation, but one thing they were very good at doing was keeping donors and stakeholders informed. And I found that the organisations that respond the best are the ones that have all that planned, right? So that just didn't kind of happen at the time. It wasn't, while we're going through the data breach, hey, we better think about this. It was something that was in the plan about having, like if we're going to notify them, we will need a call centre, or we will need to have a 24/7, contact line. We will need to get people to come in and help us with the communications. So all that happened, and I think when you're responding, one good thing is to have frequent communication, but not trying to tell people more, or trying to pretend you know more than what's happening, because you can be very open and honest and say we don't yet know exactly what has happened, but you need to have that communication and let people know that you'll provide them with more information as it comes.
I think it's quite clear that in this modern day, it's become really a big trust moment about telling people what's been happening, what's going on, because everyone is very sensitive about their personal information, their data. I do sometimes shake my head at times, because people get very hot and bothered when there was a data breach, yet previous data probably given that same data to 3 or 4 people anyway, or some organisations to sign up to some new loyalty scheme. But once it happens, people do get very concerned about it. So I think it's a big issue around that whole trust piece for organisations in terms of managing data breaches appropriately. Now, we've spoken a bit about third parties, and this is the situation which Canteen found itself in. And a lot of breaches don't actually originate within the organisation itself or its own walls. They begin somewhere else in the ecosystem: a cloud provider, software vendor, payroll provider, marketing platform, and outsourced service. So, Roel, in terms of your experience in that circumstances, what was the hardest thing? Was it getting facts, controlling the timing, communication pieces for stakeholders and customers? What were the things which you found hard dealing with the third party?
Yeah, I think the most frustrating part was that they were not being very transparent at the start, and again the fact that they went out of business was a result of them not communicating with all of the impacted charities at the time, and so they lost trust. That we said trust is so important, and then so from then on we completely changed the way we deal with third parties that we have to work with, to make sure that the baseline for them was the same baseline that we had for ourselves in terms of our data protection, and again with support from Michael, we sort of went through a process of changing a lot of our contracts to make sure there were both clauses around data breach notification to us, so that was pretty quick. Within 24 hours of them being aware of data breach themselves, they have to tell us. And then secondly, a lot of focus on data retention, which I think is an important thing happening at the moment as well with the Privacy Act reform. I think making sure that you only hold data for the amount of time that is really necessary, and then having some very clear guidelines on when you need to destruct it and how you remove that data from your systems.
Yeah, I think having a lot of data, we all like to have it because you think we might need it for something. And it's great to have massive data sets for a lot of things, but it does bring with it its own risks in terms of other compliance issues, which Rail's mentioned. And I guess, Joseph, in terms of when you see some of these things, I don't know how much you might know about, but when you see these data sets, you see lots and lots of legacy data sitting there for decades potentially.
Yeah, I think often the most vulnerable systems are the oldest. Part of it can be that they're, so old and embedded in the infrastructure that they're still doing something in the background, but nobody's really maintaining them or taking care of them or patching them. We call it patching when you update a system to have basically the latest sort of, security protective measures built in. We do find that there's a lot of sort of old servers or computers online that get breached very often, and they'll have historic data. I mean, you mentioned with the incident that you guys had, there was it was 15-year-old credit cards. A lot of those had probably expired. Maybe some of those have been renewed or whatever else, so it wasn't as significant. We do find that like some of the older data, it's not as significant because it's not as up to date. But yeah, we will find that the older servers will be vulnerable, and they will often have a lot of data stored on them.
Yeah, so a bit of data hygiene, but also legacy IT systems have their own problems.
Yeah.
So they're running in the background doing things, they just get forgotten about, they're not updated or patched, they're not supported anymore, they're doing it internally to try and just make it keep running without having to replace the system and incur the costs. But
yeah,
you expose yourself to security issues within your IT systems.
100%.
So Michael, Rail mentioned about the contracts being updated. So what are the things that you should have in your contracts about data breaches for third-party suppliers in terms of reporting and cooperation, those sorts of things?
Well, one of the things about the world that we live in now with the dependence on IT is that it's not just within an organisation. You always have other service providers, like you mentioned. So it is important to check, and usually most internal IT departments would be involved in checking the security credentials of the other organisation. But one point I want to make is that often in data breaches now, it's not necessarily the organisation. It often does involve a third party. So the third party is often the weakest link, because people do look after their own nest, so to speak, but then they forget to do proper due diligence and check credentials and other things. From a contract point of view, there are some basic things you can do. For example, when there is a breach, it is a bit of a shared responsibility, because both organisations, that is the customer, or in this case Canteen, and then the third party service provider, have obligations to the under the Privacy Act. And so it is a shared responsibility. So you've got to be clear about who will make decisions about whether or not it's notifiable. You should have some provisions in there about, agreeing on communication that is provided, or, if it is agreed that it is something that's notifiable, that you have some input into that. But yeah, there's mechanisms like that you can put in.
So we've gone through most of the process. So we've got to the other sort of side of the data breach, but once the breach is resolved, it's really not over until you've learned from it. Yeah. So one of the key things with the OIIC recommendations is always about improving your processes, learning from what's occurred, and making sure you have better processes and systems in place. So, Rail, for you, clearly, what was the things that were, or what were the learnings that we implemented from that event, Canteen?
Yeah, I think I would say the most useful part of our response plan is the decision tree that we have at the end. And every time that we do a simulation, or when we went through this real one, we go through that decision tree and make sure that we populate anything that happened that was not part of that, to just make it easier for the team that's responding. And if I'm not there, then whoever is next in that role can still follow the same process to make sure it is consistent. For this real one, it was really the third-party management. So we develop a whole series of new policies to make sure that every new vendor we work with has to go through the same process, and updating their contracts, making sure that we go through a check of all of their systems, and then also just making sure that every time you're dealing with a third party, you're asking yourself, do we really need to share all of these fields when we're sharing information? Do we need to share all of the personally identifiable information, or do they just need a couple of fields, and that's enough for the type of work that they need to do for us? And then also ensuring that only the amount of people that you need to share with them are the people that get sent. Thing again with machine learning and artificial intelligence, a lot of the work that we had to do with external parties, we can do some of that in-house. That means that we don't have to share as much information with external parties. But just doing a general review of how we work with the third parties was the biggest lesson that we learned from this specific data breach.
Yep. Joseph, what technical control or capability most often makes a difference between a controlled incident and a major breach in your experience?
As in, what controls would a business have beforehand that might influence
Correct.
how significant? That's a good question. I think one of them is knowing who to call. So, part of the challenge we have as a business is businesses often will think, oh, we don't need that until they get breached. And then they're like, oh my God, we should have done this 10 years ago and we can't live without you guys now. But also what we'll have is that often businesses will come to us after 2 to 3 weeks of trying on their own to fix an incident. And then they, finally reach out and say, hey, look, we're out of our depth. We need help. And then we come in and we can fix things within maybe a day or two. I think part of the response that we see helps businesses in terms of the controls they have in place is knowing who to call. So even you mentioned the escalation tree. In an escalation tree, you'll have, if it's, this significant or if this particular system is being affected, here's the person you need to call, or here's the group of people you need to call. Sometimes here's their phone number, here's their email address or whatever else. If there is no known entity that can help in the event of a serious breach, then sometimes, they'll be straggling around for a week or 2 or 3 or maybe even more trying to fix things on their own, and it ends up making it a lot worse than it needed to be, perhaps, including in terms of how then they have to communicate to their customers and say, hey, look, we took 3 weeks before we brought in some experts, and your customers are like, well, why did you take so long? This could have been a lot. This could have been a lot better in terms of outcomes. So I think the incident response exercises where you kind of go through the simulation of it helps you find those weak spots that you can then fill in, whether it is having a dedicated team you can bring in or knowing who internally is responsible for what. I think for me, that's been one of the major things we've seen. And then also the other one is the defense in depth I mentioned earlier, where if you assume compromise at each level, then you kind of layer your defense, as it were. And then if somebody breaks into one layer, you've still got protection beyond that, and so on and so forth. And we will find companies who do that. Their outcomes are just so much better because the blast radius is just minimized far smaller than what it would otherwise be.
Yeah. And look, that's sometimes a luxury of having resources available. But it's about scaling things to what's appropriate to your organization, because one of the things which is required is about doing things which are reasonable. So the question for you, Michael, in terms of the legal aspects, what are the things which you would look at in terms of being a reasonable response or reasonable actions to protect your IT systems?
Yeah, thanks for that question.
That's all right.
Okay, so what's reasonable? So I think at a minimum, I kind of mentioned before about having a data response plan, right? So an organisation needs to be prepared. I think a board should be making sure that you not only have a plan, but it's tested or simulated, right? I think Joseph has sort of said at least once a year. The other things that you should be doing, of course, is just, general cyber security awareness, so all those phishing exercises, all that sort of thing. But when it comes to reasonableness, that's a good question. But maybe I'll lean on a report that was published mid-July by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner about the response of Qantas to the data breach that it had in 2025. And I was looking at that report just over the last week or so, just trying to prepare for this presentation. But one thing that I found in it was that they kind of concluded that Qantas was not in breach of any of the Australian privacy principles. And they found that, and part of it was around the fact that, they had a plan, they had, evidence that they had, simulated it. They had training for people, even though I think in the Qantas breach, there was a third-party call centre that was involved in the breach. That was the person who someone called and then got access into a system. So there was training and they could demonstrate that there had been training and they could demonstrate that there was an awareness, right? So a board, isn't going to be responsible just for any breach that occurs. They have to just make sure that there's reasonable steps. And I think a lot of the things we've spoken about today would kind of tick that box.
So one of the important things which us lawyers love is seeing documentation, making sure that you actually have things which you can point to and say, we've run this process, we've had this training, we've done our penetration testing last 12 months, here's the records of it, here are the board minutes. You can point to these things and say, we've tried to do things as best as we can for our organisation. That at least gets you a good way along to proving that you've taken reasonable steps. And that can help in a lot of situations, not just with the regulator, but even with class actions as well, because they're typically framed in a negligence phase. So have you done things in a reasonable manner? If you can show that evidence there, it can protect you from some of those claims as well, potentially. So that's an important thing in terms of your internal governance process. It's keep that documentation. So pretty much about to wrap it up because we're getting close to time. One question each, quick one sentence. What's one thing organisations should do in the next month to be better prepared, Michael?
Well, I would say make sure you have an incident response plan. And if you haven't tested it, test it.
Rail.
Start preparing for the next tranche of the Privacy Act reform. A few things coming.
Joseph.
I would say get multi-factor authentication enabled on all of your accounts in your organization. I assume most of you know what that is. It's the password, and then you've got this sort of second, number. Don't use text-based. It's quite easy to get past text-based. Yeah.
I've got to say those things drive me insane, but they're important to have. I get it.
Well, you can get a password manager. We use Dashlane. If you guys haven't used it, look into it. Dashlane's amazing, and you can store your second factor inside of Dashlane, which allows you to populate it and takes away a lot of the.
Speak after then.
Yeah, we should
definitely probably need that, particularly given I forgot my password and my PIN number yesterday off my computer and locked myself out because I was using Face ID and it just didn't work. But anyway. We have some time for questions. Has anyone from the floor got any questions? I don't have got any online questions. Charlotte, do you have anything that's come through at all?
Nothing yet.
Nothing yet?
No.
So we've been awesome in terms of what we've been telling people. No questions required. We've answered everything. Any questions at all from anyone?
To pay a ransom or not to pay a ransom?
Depends how big it is, I guess. I don't know.
What happened in the...
It's an interesting one because we found out that the recommendations on that have changed over time. And what we learned was that depending on the actor that you're dealing with, in some situations, it is recommended to pay. So we were very surprised by that. In our simulations, we've been going through that scenario. And then because that will go over our limits of authority, then the board will have to make that final decision. But I found that quite surprising. And I don't know how common it is that people end up paying, but just finding out that it could end up with a recommendation to pay, that was very surprising.
I think it ends up being about 50-50 split, at least from when I last read. Like Raul said, it's kind of changed over time with recommendations and also in country. But something to bear in mind, a lot of these hacker gangs, some of them are just, blatant. We don't, care about businesses and we just want to wreak havoc and make some money off it. We don't care. There's some that really see themselves as like, a sophisticated business operation and, on their own websites on the dark web, if you go to them, they'll talk about how, we do good business and we stay true to our word and so on and so forth. And if you pay the ransom, we will always give your data back. So part of it is actually knowing which gang you might be dealing with, because some of them really are true to their word until they're not. And so knowing who you're dealing with can kind of give you an idea as to whether or not you should take that risk. But we don't do ransomware negotiations. There's typically organizations that do that as a dedicated service. And part of it is knowing the intel. But yeah, from what I've seen over the last number of years, it's about a 50-50 split. And there's various reasons why people will cite that they'll pay it. And one of them is cost. How much is it? Is it $10 million and you're a $20 million revenue business? Or is it, 200,000 or less and you make $50 million a year? Relatively insignificant.
One of the things for me would be about what information they have access to and whether or not you can access your backups, right? Because I think whereas, years ago it was kind of like a dirty thing to have suffered a breach, I don't think it is anymore. So I'd be thinking if the information wasn't something that was going to cause people too much harm, and we had a backup of all that data, and we could, get our systems back up and running, then I'd be thinking of not paying. But it would just depend on the circumstances.
Yeah, there are definitely different reasons that they'll cite for asking for a ransom. One is, hey, we're going to publish all your information on the dark web, or it might be, we'll wipe all your systems. If they're going to wipe all your systems, obviously it's a bit more significant than we're going to publish this data. We saw one case where a gang said, hey, we're going to publish all this information on the dark web. And we kind of, paid for a piece of it to read through it and realized, oh, this is already basically public information. Okay, go ahead and post it. And they did, and there was no impact. So depends on the situation.
Yep, good. I find it oh, sorry.
I have a question for Michael. As a victim of several data breaches over the last 2 years, including Qantas and Medibank Private, I found the quality of the comps to be terrible. What are the sort of things you would be recommending to businesses put in their comps?
Well, I think, the type of information would be just what they know, right? Don't try and say anything that they don't know. But one of the things that I found helpful is having a PR agency involved in the response team. So often they're not as cold as lawyers in writing words. So I think, because the whole idea is to try and demonstrate that, empathy and care for the person, and you want to establish that trust. And I think, getting a PR agency or someone who's better at that marketing, because it is a bit of a marketing exercise. But in terms of exactly what you put in, I think it depends on the circumstances. But one thing that I think is really good is trying to give people information about how they can protect themselves. Right? So, giving them some awareness about the type of information that has been taken, if you know what that is, and then giving them some ideas about what they can do or what steps they can take or who they can contact to minimise harm to themselves.
Oh, I'm going to say that you're speaking for yourself when you say lawyers can be cold, because I'm a warm and fuzzy guy.
Yeah, I know.
But I was just quickly on the ransomware thing. Are there you say some of them are business people. So I'm assuming that when they get the ransom, they are true to their word and they give the stuff back.
Yeah, some of them really do.
Yeah, so they can do it again and go, you can trust me.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah,
it's just, run of the mill, the same way that if your car breaks down, you go to the mechanic and they fix it up and leave one of the screws loose the next time you come around. Kind of a similar deal, yeah.
Fascinating. What an interesting world we live in. But yeah, I guess there is honour among thieves after all. So thank you to our panellists for joining us today. We'll wrap it up there. I think this is one theme from the discussion, is that data breach isn't just a technology issue. It's a test of governance, preparation, legal judgment, operational resilience, and I think the big thing is also trust. So the takeaways from this, I think, are preparation is response. Actually have something in place, test it, make sure it's there and ready to go when you need it. Speed and accuracy, you've got to manage those things together. And notification is about people, not just about a compliance tick box. Third-party risk is still your risk as well. You can't just push it off to one side and think we're great here, but as we've said today, a lot of these issues that impact you are caused by third-party service providers who you've given information to. And, it's really about where do you build resilience within your organisation with the plans that you put in place so you can respond to these things effectively. So thank you again to our panellists. We hope today's discussion has helped you prepare your organisation before an incident occurs, because when it does, then the quality of response is what will matter, and it'll also probably save you a lot of grief and heartache as well. So please thank our panellists, and thank you for all your attention today, and it's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.